I was diagnosed at 68. That sentence hangs in my mouth like a bell. Clear, unavoidable. And the sound changed the way I counted my days. When the doctor used the word diagnosis, I remember the light in the clinic. Too bright for midday. And the way Richard's hand found mine without asking. It felt, for a moment, as if the rest of my life had been put in a neat folder and handed back to me with a note. Read this now. Until that afternoon, I had been someone who kept a life in boxes. Achievements catalogued on my resume, meetings that marked my weeks, emails that measured my usefulness. My calendar was proof I was doing something important. The diagnosis made me see, with the bluntness of hospital paper, that proof is not the same as presence. I am an ordinary woman with an ordinary set of regrets. I worked for years in a job that liked to measure sacrifice as loyalty. I told myself I was doing it for my family, that my long hours, travel, and late-night calls were building a secure future for Margaret and Catherine. I said later more than I said here. Small things accumulated like dust. A crayon drawing tucked behind a stack of bills and forgotten for months. A voicemail from my sister I never opened because I was in a conference call. An evening I missed because a deadline suddenly mattered more than a promise. Those omissions felt defensible then. Sacrifice felt noble. But the diagnosis at 68 stripped the sophistry away. Sacrifice had become an excuse for absence. Memory is a particular kind of thief. It steals time, then keeps what it takes. I remember the drawing on the refrigerator so clearly that I can see the texture of the paper when I close my eyes. The thick tooth of kindergarten stock, the swollen glob of blue paint that was supposed to be the lake. It was the kind of drawing a parent tapes to the fridge and then forgets, because the parent is juggling calendars and keys and a to-do list that insists on getting finished. Years later, when I pulled the faded paper from a drawer, the glue at its corners had dried into a film that flakes when touched. Margaret was 8 then. She had pressed her name at the edge in shaky letters. I had tucked it away after a busy week and told myself I would put it back this weekend. That weekend never came. There are quieter moments that scream in retrospect. An empty chair at a parent-teacher night where my name appeared on the attendance sheet. But my face did not. The sound of the kettle left boiling because I had to take a 1-hour call about a merged account. The birds at the feeder outside our kitchen window I barely watched. Their tiny, urgent movements a life I could have kept company with if I had slowed down. When I look back, I see a pattern more than a single failure. A pattern of choosing the measurable over the meaningful. Work gave me spreadsheets and plaques. Home offered unquantifiable smallness. I convinced myself the plaques mattered more than the late-night stories I missed. My mother died the year I turned 60. The call, her last, went to voicemail because I stepped away from my desk for an urgent meeting. I listened to her message later that night and hated myself for listening to it too late. Grief folded into my professional rhythm as if it, too, were another item to be checked. I told myself I was honoring her memory by making sure the family had security. I told myself that I could be more useful to my daughters with a stable bank account than with a warm presence that would only be there for a few more decades. It is astonishing how convincingly we can lie to ourselves when the lie keeps the schedule intact. Richard was a patient man. He found ways to show love that were small and steady. He kept the garden watered. He always poured a second cup of tea without asking. And he loved the birds more than I did. He would leave an extra sweater on the back of a chair because he suspected I might be cold at a board meeting. He never demanded I change. He loved me enough to let me be busy, and perhaps that is why it took so long for me to see the truth. He did not complain. He made room for my ambition, and so, confusingly, I read his silence as tacit approval. I hid the distance between us with late-night emails and weekend work, thinking time would eventually reconcile what my choices had unsettled. When the diagnosis came, it was not cinematic. There were no grand revelations in the waiting room, no loud pronouncements. It was instead a quiet unraveling, a single word that opened a door no one had noticed. In the car afterward, Richard said nothing for a long time. He held my hand like he had always held my hand, gentle, steady. The one decision came not from desperation, but from a clarity I had never allowed myself. I could keep doing what I'd always done, schedule my life around meetings and let my family fit into the leftover spaces. Or I could choose, finally, to rearrange my priorities. The decision itself was small in form and enormous in effect. I did not make a dramatic speech. I did not stage a sweeping exit from my career. I turned off my work laptop one Friday evening and left it closed. I sat at the kitchen table where the birds came to the feeder, and I asked Richard if he wanted to go for a walk. The walk felt like a vow, because it was the first time in a long time that the choice to be with someone felt deliberate, not accidental. The next week I spoke with my supervisor and negotiated fewer travels and a shorter schedule. I told Margaret and Catherine about the diagnosis, and more importantly, I told them about the decision that followed. It was the hardest confession I had ever made. Not that I was ill, but that I had spent decades absent in the name of a future I had imagined for them. Making that choice did not erase the past. There were immediate, practical changes. Fewer long calls, more lunches at home, turning the notifications off on my phone for entire evenings. I began to keep small rituals. I taped a new drawing to the fridge, even if the artist was grown. I started answering missed calls the same day. I learned the names of the birds at the feeder. Those gestures felt foolish at first, like performing presence to make up for decades of absence. But presence is a habit like any other. It is learned by repetition. I started to notice things. How Richard's knuckles had a speckled fade from years of digging in the garden. The precise way Margaret frowned when she was thinking about an old slight. The way Catherine tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she was nervous. I learned to sit with people without trying to fix them. That was the hardest part. Accepting companionship as an end in itself, not a reward for being useful. Not everything softened. There was a polite distance at first from Margaret, who had learned to armor herself with schedules and self-sufficiency. Catherine was kinder in ways I did not deserve. She accepted my calls, but sometimes there was a measured pause before she allowed affection back in. Reconciliation is not a magic switch. It is a slow turning, a relearning of trust that sometimes does not come at all. I had to accept that some moments were irrevocable. Promises of presence are not the same as presence itself. My daughters did not owe me forgiveness. They owed no one anything. The only thing I could offer was a consistent, honest attempt to be there now. There were tender successes. I attended a small gathering Margaret organized and listened without proposing solutions. I helped Catherine paint an old chest at my kitchen table and realized how small, shared tasks restore intimacy more effectively than grand gestures. Richard and I had evenings where we read aloud to each other, and once I finally learned the rhythm of the birds' visits because I stopped to watch rather than schedule life around them. There were meals at home where the focus was simply being together, without the undercurrent of after this or when I finish this task. Those nights felt like an economy shift. I stopped measuring time by productivity and started measuring it by memory, by the small ledger of moments that matter. And then, inevitably, Richard grew older. The diagnosis did not mean immediate catastrophe, and my decision did not grant us forever. He had health issues that came and went, Some days were luminous and others heavy. In his last year, when the garden lost some of its meticulous order and his hands trembled more, I was there in ways I had not been before. We made small rituals, holding hands over the kettle, reading a sentence of a book together each night. I saw his face as it quieted, and though grief had been a distant concept earlier in my life, now it was a presence that sat with me at the sink. When Richard died, I had already learned how to be with him in his decline. I had said things I needed to say, and I had done things I had once promised, but postponed. That does not mean my sorrow was diminished, but it did mean there were no glaring omissions in our last days that I could not live with. If my story has a moral, it is not that decisions are miraculous. It is that decisions matter. The single choice, the quiet, stubborn act of stepping back from the endless calendar, shifted the axis of the rest of my life. It did not redeem lost time, but it changed the way I used the time that remained. Presence does not undo the past. It makes the future legible in a new way. I learned that later is a word that can turn into never with the ease of a snapping twig. I do not tell this story to shackle you with regret. I tell it to make a small, stubborn point. You do not need a dramatic diagnosis to decide to be present. You do not have to wait for a wake-up call to arrange your life in the service of the people you love. And yet, I know how complicated the world is. Jobs are necessary. Responsibilities are real. The choice I made was possible because of certain privileges I had. It was not a universal prescription, but the principle is simple. Presence is an intentional act, not an accidental byproduct of success. If this resonates, take a moment now to think of one person you've been telling yourself you'll get to later. Don't act yet, just notice. Who is the name that comes up? What small thing would it mean to show up for them this week? Hold that question with gentleness, not as a demand, but as an invitation. There were practical shifts that helped me. I set boundaries at work that I honored even when it felt uncomfortable. I learned to say no to things that would eat into evenings. I created small rituals that asked little but signaled everything. A Wednesday night walk, a Sunday afternoon call without agenda, a paper taped to the fridge because its presence matters more than its preservation. I made space for imperfection. Being present does not mean being perfect. It meant answering the phone when my daughter called, sitting in the room while my son-in-law told a story, even if it was about something I could not fix. It meant listening more than speaking. These are not heroic acts. They are ordinary, repeated, and they hold weight. There will be people who do not respond the way you hope. There will be consequences you cannot erase. Some bridges you try to cross may be collapsed. I faced the fact that there were parts of my daughter's lives I would never reclaim. I had lost birthdays I could not retrieve, conversations that had hardened into silence. But I also found openings, small, honest ones where laughter returned, where trust budded anew. Those were the moments that made the decision worth making. Now, years after that clinic and the day I first understood what the diagnosis meant, I live differently. My house is still small. My days are still filled with obligations. But there is a different center to my life. I keep a fresh drawing on the refrigerator, even though the artist is grown and paints on canvas now. I watch the birds. I answer calls. I do not believe that presence is a panacea, and I do not pretend that my choice erased pain. What it did was give shape to my remaining days. It taught me to value the small, stubborn things. The way a hand rests on a shoulder, the sound of someone telling a story, the ordinary look of being witnessed. If anything in my story touches you, I invite you to leave a brief thought below. Maybe a name or a small memory you carry. Share it if this moved you with someone who keeps saying, later. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, please subscribe. We are all in some way moving through time with imperfect tools. The kindness of shared stories is that they make the path feel less lonely. I was diagnosed at 68. That day I stopped lying to myself. The single decision that followed did not restore every lost hour, but it reshaped what remained. Presence is not a grand gesture. It is a series of small choices, quietly kept. If you have a moment to spare, consider who deserves one of those choices from you.